Hello and welcome to the Agora Politics podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Gabriel. Gabriel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. So we've got an interesting topic here today. You yourself actually started one of the earliest Bitcoin brokerage firms. Not
Yes.
yeah, not here in the United States, but actually up in Canada. And I'm sure that was an interesting experience. And you're going to be able to tell us all more about it in a minute. But before we get into that, I just want to frame the the conversation for today, which is around this concept of Bitcoin, but not only Bitcoin. I'd say the crypto space more generally, DeFi, um, blockchains, maybe even other types of data structures that you know more about than I would for consensus building. And really, the reason I wanted to have Gabriel on is not just for his brokerage experience, which I find actually extremely intriguing, but also to talk a little bit more about how he thinks about, the implications that these technologies might have for governance. And I'll just give a little bit of a backstory here. So I remember when I read the Bitcoin white paper, Satoshi's paper. It was a long time ago. I think I probably first encountered it in like 2012. Yeah, it would have been when I went off to college. And then I also later on read the Ethereum white paper when that came out, I believe in 2014. And both of the times that I read those papers, I wasn't super bullish on crypto very early, but I did see, I'd say pretty much immediately, that this technology was going to be a huge impact on not only the economy, but also the way that we organize decision making, right, and the way that governance happens more generally. And so that's why I wanted to have you on today, Gabriel. But before we get into those broad questions, can you tell us a little bit more about your experience opening up one of the earliest Bitcoin brokerages? What got you first excited about Bitcoin and why you decided to go that route?
Yeah. So kind of starting from the beginning, like the way that I first learned about Bitcoin was a little bit of a circuitous path. So I was kind of in a mindset of trying to think of like ideas to build a company around. And I had this idea that, wouldn't it be cool if you could find some alternative to advertisements to powering kind of like the free internet? And the idea that I had was, well, what could a user give you in exchange for the free content? And the idea was, well, they have computing power in the browser that they could trade, and maybe that's useful enough to actually justify giving you the content for free and not showing you advertisements. So I was kind of like going down this rabbit hole. And the issue with this is like you can't just do any old like computation. You have to where like because most computation you have to know like the answer to the first part before you can even ask the second part. So you have to find something that's like massively parallelizable. And so I was looking for problems that were parallelizable but also monetizable. And like in researching this, I came across Bitcoin. I think similarly around
What year was this?
like 2012, I think, similar to
Okay.
you. Yeah, somewhere in there. And just became really fascinated by the technology itself. Like fell in love with Bitcoin as an idea. And at the time I was kind of really just thinking a lot about financial systems, like how the Fed works, sort of inflation built into our system, quantitative easing, kind of just feeling like, well, this is an injustice. And so I was really excited about Bitcoin and started just getting into it in different ways. Started building like arbitrage bots because there were just huge price discrepancies at the exchanges on those times. So you would see like 10% difference in prices. So you
Mhm.
could just like make a good amount of money circulating your money through these exchanges. And I was in college at the time too, so that was really nice for me. Started mining as well, like started doing Litecoin mining because that was still doable at the time on graphics cards. And yeah, I think I asked a question on Stack Overflow, which is like a popular question and answer forum, and I was like, "Where can you buy Litecoin?" And the question just blew up. It got like, I think hundreds of thousands of people were reading it. And so I just created a landing page for a website and was like, Litecoin exchange coming soon, and got thousands of signups for it. And so I was like, okay, now we build a Bitcoin exchange or a Litecoin exchange. Like, how hard could it be? Um, so that's what the beginning of like the reason to start doing this project was, and just started going down the path like, okay, well, how do you actually launch an exchange? Like, on the one hand, there's the technology side of it, like, okay, you need to build a wallet, you need to be able to source liquidity from somewhere, but you also need to interface with the actual financial system. You need to make sure you're doing this legally, and that's a really big headache. So yeah, at the time, the de facto understanding in the US was that if you wanted to be a Bitcoin exchange or brokerage, you had to follow what's called money service business regulation. And money service business it's a super onerous regulatory scheme because it's defined in every single state individually, and you actually have to apply in every state, and you have to put up different bonding requirements, go through different application schemes. So it's a real pain in the ass. So what we ended up doing was launching in Canada because they had a much clearer compliance framework for how you could go about doing this. We were able to find a payment processor in Canada that was willing to work with us. We were able to, source liquidity from Canadian exchanges, and we launched there. And then we also ultimately launched in a few states in the U.S. that did, have a clear framework for like doing this without the burden of going through this huge licensing process.
So
So yeah.
I'm sure it's changed, but what states were the most friendly to your operation?
Mm, I can't even say I remember the exact list, but it was kind of like Wyoming, I think
Mm.
Nevada, um, Oregon. I don't remember. Don't like there were a few. Today, like most crypto companies have decided that a much easier approach is to actually go about getting trust licensing. So most of the big U.S. crypto firms are either trust companies or actually Wyoming is leaning into heavily into being like the crypto friendly state. So they've created a special banking charter that you can apply for as a crypto firm. Most of the times when you apply for a banking charter, you have to provide a business case for how you're going to lend money. Like, you have to prove that you can lend money profitably to get a banking charter. And people that want banking licenses to be crypto firms have no interest in lending money because
Mm.
it's not really their model. They're really just trying to get access to the Fed and access to the Nacha and the wire networks. Um, so Wyoming's created this carve out for them. So that's pretty cool. So like Kraken, I believe, got their banking charter in Wyoming. I think Square also did. Could be wrong about that, but yeah.
Cool, cool. And you know, so obviously you had this opportunity where you created this landing page, it got hugely popular, and then you said, "Oh crap, I better actually build this thing." Um, at the time, did you have any kind of, let's say, ideological commitments to the idea of decentralized currency? Like, what was your conception of Bitcoin at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. I was very much an ideological believer in creating a money system that couldn't be manipulated by the government. I was kind of a political mindset such that inflation is kind of this secret tax, is theft from the general
Yes.
populace. And so if you can have a system that's able to avoid that, then that's really cool. And kind of like having this sovereignty of money that existed independent of the nation state was like a really appealing idea to me. And I think that idea has been taken a lot further with this idea of just generalized distributed computing, into spheres beyond money. But I was really excited about it from just a pure money perspective at the time.
Yeah. So what ended up happening with that exchange?
Yeah, so I think we had a decent level of success. We did several $1 million of transaction volume, but when you're charging 1% on trades, it's not that satisfying of a business to be in. And what ultimately ended up happening was Coinbase raised $100 million and entered the Canadian market, and we just didn't see a viable path forward. I mean, in retrospect, I think had we just stayed at it and held on to any reasonable amount of cryptocurrency, it would have turned out great. But hindsight's 2020.
Yeah.
So we ended up just putting it out there that we were wanting to sell the business, and found a buyer, and we're able to pay back our investors and profit a little bit.
Cool, cool. What did Coinbase do that was different than the existing solutions that were in the market? Was it really just the consumer side, like getting the nice app that people can sort of just access without understanding very much?
Yeah, at the time that was a really big deal because just using an exchange is a intimidating experience for someone that doesn't have familiarity with it. Or I mean, even just the idea of like how an order book works and what a market is something most people don't have a grasp of, I think.
Mhm.
So just that really clean interface where it's like you buy some Bitcoin. How many Bitcoin do you want? Here's the price.
Yeah.
Is really straightforward. I think they've done a lot more since then, but that's what got them in the door.
Cool. And so how has your thinking evolved, since that experience? Are you still working in the blockchain space? Uh, and do you have a different perspective either on Bitcoin, or is there some other technology that you're more excited about? How have you evolved since that experience?
hmm Um, yeah. So I think um, my thinking's evolved a lot about blockchain, about what can be done with decentralized technologies. I think one thing, I was kind of like my thought always was, and part of the reason maybe that led to the selling of the brokerage in the first place was it was a crypto like down period, I think, at the time. Um, and my thought was, crypto can succeed, but the price doesn't need to be crazy. Like there's no reason that those two things have to happen. Like you can have this decentralized monetary system without having Bitcoin go to $1 million, right? So, and at the time it was like $1,000. So it seemed crazy that it would get to where it is today. Um, and so I was a big believer in that future, but I wasn't sure that it would come with the the price.
Hmm.
So that was one thing, and I think maybe the natural dynamics of it are such that maybe I at least underestimated the potential for that price increase. Um, I think you also have these proliferation of new types of digital currencies, right? You have Ethereum was the first one where they're kind of trying to say we're going to be the world computer, and they've
Yes.
kind of backed off of that a little bit because they're like, well, our computer's really slow. Um, and but I think that's a really interesting idea, and you want to have like why don't we want to have our core internet infrastructure be built in a decentralized way? Like why do we want to have it be censorable by centralized parties? Um, and or just like have total visibility into it, have it be auditable, or have visibility into it. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, so uh, you've pointed out then some skepticism you had about Bitcoin that came up, just in terms of the, I guess I don't know if you're really getting at like this scarcity component, because I think you still believe in scarcity, right? The importance of not simply
It's scarce,
devaluing
but it's also infinitely divisible, or not infinitely, but really
practically.
divisible.
Yeah. Um, and yeah, so Ethereum has some throughput problems. What technology are you most excited about right now?
Well, so I think that there's a lot of interesting ways to add scalability to blockchains. So Ethereum's trying to do proof of stake, they're trying to do ETH 2.0.
Yes.
Then you have kind of like the sort of layer one alternatives, which are, okay, how can we create some sort of blockchain that has much higher throughput? And usually the way you do this is by trading um, centralization in some way. So you can say, oh well, if we actually condense the nodes that are validating transactions, then we can speed up throughput a lot more. I think the technology I'm currently most excited about from a like let's crank the speed on blockchains perspective is like the avalanche technology, and they have their Snow set of consensus algorithms where their idea is that they are, instead of like validating transactions sequentially,
Mhm.
there's a probabilistic approach to it where it's like if the ordering doesn't matter and all nodes don't have to have total knowledge of every transaction at all times, but you can still have very strong guarantees around like avoiding double spend, which is the core
Yeah.
kind of problem you're trying to address. Um, so I'm excited about that, but I also think that there's somewhat blockchain is in a way it's kind of overhyped as a solution to decentralized architecture, right?
Yeah.
Like nature is highly decentralized, but it doesn't work like a blockchain. Like with a blockchain, you have to have, or at least in sort of like the Nakamoto consensus, like the way Bitcoin works, the way Ethereum currently works, every single node has to have complete knowledge of every single transaction on the network. And so your throughput is defined by your slowest node.
Mhm.
and and also you, if you want to do anything, it has to be copied to every player in the space, and that's kind of undesirable. And so you could imagine doing something like, oh, let's say I wanted to create a decentralized version of Twitter, right? Well, you could imagine that maybe you want to know your own tweets and you want to know the tweets of the people that you follow. And if you ever need to like reload your account, you can always just go, hey, friends, like you probably follow some of the same people as I do. Can I get a copy of all the tweets I care about? Right. And you could create a network like that that doesn't have that sort of like crazy amount of duplication, that's way more efficient. Right. And so I'm also interested in just like decentralized like frameworks for building decentralized applications that maybe have components of blockchain but
Mhm.
aren't rigorously blockchain, because
Yeah.
blockchain really cares about not having people spend money twice, and that's really important if you're trying to build a decentralized money system, but it's not as important for other kinds of decentralized systems where it's like if someone publishes a tweet on your behalf but it gets removed in 30 seconds, it's no big deal. But if someone publishes like a spend on your behalf and then they can permanently extract value from the network in that 30-second period, you've got a big problem.
Hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like, depending on the use case, um, there could be other structures that are just that serve you better in terms of, uh well, I wouldn't say robustness, but like in terms of redundancy, right? Um and are you familiar with like the hash graph?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So hash graph is like another um consensus algorithm that is sort of attempting to sort of supersede blockchain in many ways. And I believe the issue with Hashgraph is there's only like one company that can use it, but um, that's like the most recent thing that I'm aware of. That's sort of is following the principles of decentralization, but isn't using a blockchain for it. So
Hmm.
um, all right, so I want to get into my I guess sort of the core of why we're talking about, decentralized decentralized finance, decentralized applications more generally, which is the implications for governance. So where do I want to start? Because you could start almost anywhere with this. Um, in a way, the ambition of Bitcoin regardless of whether or not it will ultimately be realized, if you think that Bitcoin will be a world currency, maybe if you think it will just exist in a pool among many other currencies, that's probably, I'd say, the scenario that I think is most likely at this point. But Bitcoin could reign supreme. It could be the most valuable currency. I just don't think it'll be the only one.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think the narrative is it's gold 2.0, and
yes, yeah,
it's the only contender for that narrative, and maybe it wins.
yeah. So in terms of the design space that Satoshi Nakamoto was working in, he actually crafted something very tight, despite whatever its flaws might be. That is actually hard to improve upon, I'd say, in terms of its core functionality. That being said, and I don't mean as a medium for exchange necessarily. um, that being said, one of the core aspects of Bitcoin that I think you can come around to more readily if you understand the Ethereum architecture is that it's outsourcing a particular function of the state, right? So the state uh, establishes the monetary system, it prints money, it determines as part of its sovereign charter what the valid, unit of exchange or currency is going to be within its domain, and then through various kinds of monetary policy, it can manipulate and arbitrage uh, that currency, and also change the way in which it interfaces with other currencies. And so there's all kinds of scheming that goes on within the global financial system between currencies, and manipulation, and different kinds of trades that you can do to kind of leech, yeah, I guess arbitrage between the sort of patchwork of established currencies that exist. Um, and when you take that decentralized component as an operation of the state, and you extend that out with something like Ethereum, which allows a Turing complete computation network, you then start to realize that there are many other operations of the state that could also be outsourced or reformatted in this decentralized way. And so, how do you think about the implications of decentralization? Let's say decentralization. Say, I'm not even sure what word to use, because I would use blockchain, but like it's sort of more than blockchain at this point. Um, Decentralized technologies. Uh, how do you think about the implications of decentralized technologies for our current governance structures that exist? And
Hmm.
I'll let you just go off that.
Yeah, so I mean, initially I was very bullish on the idea of like the DAO, or the decentralized autonomous or anonymous organization. Pick your A, but I, I think in thinking about it a lot more, it's definitely not a silver bullet. Like, I don't think that just because you decentralize government, all of a sudden government doesn't become good, and you run into like the advantage of a human government is that you can kind of be a little loose with your rules. You can be flexible on them. You're not rigid in like the rules. Like, these rules are definitely immutable, and these rules are mutable. In these ways, like, everything's a little bit fuzzy, and everything, if you push on it hard enough, like, there's no magic to the law. Like, I'm a fan of this kind of idea, of legal realism, which is like, you on the one hand you have what's written, but the law is actually what the legal actors in the system carry out. Like, what do the judges actually do? What do the police actually? Who are they actually listening to? Who is the army actually listening to? Like, that's what the law is. Um, and so on the one hand, like, okay, so you could say we have this like smart contract based legal system, but to the extent that we want that legal system to actually have an impact on our physical world, right? It still comes down to, are people actually respecting what's being said? Okay, the contract spits out, attack country B, but like, are they going to do it? Are they going to listen? Like, that's still important. So, contracts can kind of have like absolute sovereignty over things in the digital realm, over things that live in, the virtual machine that is kind of Ethereum, right?
Hmm.
So a classic example of like an easy system to build is you could have a will, right? And you could have this, you put money in here and you say, hey, if I don't check in with you every year, distribute the money to these four people, right? Or you could make it a governance system where you could allow, say, three people to check in. And or you could have them manipulate, like, oh well, this person's allowed to vote that actually, like, we don't like her, she gets 10% less or something.
Hmm.
um so you have the problem of enforceability, like in the smart contract world. Smart contracts can have things that exist in the sort of computer. And then you get to this other problem of kind of like oracles, where are you actually getting the information from? You could have this sort of decentralized betting network where you allow people to vote, to place bets on who's going to be the next president, you know? But it's like, well, who tells it who actually won? Someone has to do it. Someone has to be
So,
the authority.
do you mind just for the listeners telling the audience a little bit about what an oracle is exactly?
So an oracle, is a term used in crypto DeFi stuff a lot, which is referring to basically your information source. Like for something that needs to be told, kind of like this, who won the election, right? Like
Hmm.
the blockchain has no knowledge of that. It has to be told it externally. Or if you wanted to have a will that actually looked at, the death records of a county, like the county would be the oracle in that case. So you can get clever and you can kind of construct systems that don't rely on an oracle, right? So on the one hand, you could look at the death records of the county. On the other hand, you could do kind of like a dead man switch proof of life thing, where it's like, as long as I check in, assume I'm alive. If I don't check in for some period of time, assume I'm dead, right? That system doesn't require an oracle. But so you get into these governance problems, and then very quickly, like, you arrive at needs for oracles all over the place.
Hmm.
So a big problem in crypto is like, how do you actually, come up with reputable oracles? And I think there's some interesting, I think as the crypto space matures, you get into these, you start being able to like use crypto systems as oracles themselves, right? So for instance, if you wanted to have a, like, um an option trading system, right? And you need to know you need to know like the price of the underlying asset to be able to make the option contract work. You can actually use a decentralized exchange as your pricing source, right? So that's kind of cool. So like your decentralized exchange becomes your oracle.
Hmm.
So you can do those two things. But so, okay, so for starters, in the world of governance, right, you have this oracle problem, which is very hard to get away from. And then you have this, like, well, at the end of the day, you're relying on the actors in the system to actually enforce the rules. So, like, I don't really think you can get away from either of those problems. But
Yeah.
then, yeah,
Well, anyway, I was gonna say, like, yeah, there is this issue of like you're not really ever going to automate the entire thing. There still has to be this human component. There still have to be humans participating in the network in order to continue feeding it data, in order to update it properly. And so there are certain things you can verify the veracity of, but you're not necessarily going to eliminate that human component. And I think that's where you run into like some of the limitations for example, what many of us would have thought that DAOs might bring. And maybe they'll eventually get there. But for right now, um, it there's still a lot of like, yeah, there's still a lot of like fuzziness, I guess, around what exactly is possible and what's viable. To prepare for this and also just for my own investigations, I've looked into some of the applications that are currently in place in governments, uh, how they have tried to use blockchain technologies, mostly blockchain technologies, to you know run their operations differently. I'd say the most prominent example of this would be Estonia. So Estonia was very early in the crypto space. They even claimed that they were building out blockchains before Bitcoin was released, which is curious, but in like 2007. But Estonia has actually, basically just added huge chunks of their government onto blockchain systems, right? Instead of central, and the basic innovation here isn't too crazy. They just, instead of having these centralized databases, they have a decentralized database for things like voting and banking and various aspects of citizenship verification. For example, you can become a digital citizen of Estonia even if you don't live there. I'm not aware of any other country that allows you to do that or what exactly that means, but it does entitle you to some benefits and so forth that operating within the Estonian governmental ecosystem that really calls into question, like, for example, like, why am I still going to the DMV? like, like I
Well,
don't
that's a
know.
great question. I mean, we don't need decentralized technology to solve those problems, right?
Yeah,
That's just
yeah.
like run of the mill government dysfunction. But
Well, there is some added benefit to security and transparency. So, for example, um, one of the arguments, you're correct that you have to not get carried away and just say, oh well, we're just gonna like throw it on a blockchain and we don't really have a reason for it. We just think it'll be better because it's like using that buzzword or something. Um,
mhm,
there are reasons for doing so. One of which, for example, is that if you make a, for example, in their medical system, if you make a change to a medical record, there's no way for someone to go in and tamper that medical record or remove it or change it in some way. And so it actually does limit the abuse of governmental powers in that sense.
that's true. I
Because,
mean, it
yeah.
also it creates a new class of issue too. Like, for instance, say you have like a property titling for a county is done on the blockchain, right?
Mhm.
And so when you buy a house, what you're actually buying is the private key to that, ledger entry in the sort of like property registry that the county maintains. Okay.
Yeah.
And, in cryptocurrencies, when you lose your private key, you're screwed, right? Your crypto's gone. Okay. If you lose your private key, do you lose your house? And okay, maybe you can create a new system where it's like, okay, but actually if a sufficient number of your neighbors vote that you actually control that house, then you get your key back, right? And we have a smart contract that generates it. So you can avoid abuses by sort of the small town clerk like redrawing property lines for bribes, but you also get this whole new class of issue. Like what if I do want to change something? What if someone forgets something? What if someone entered data incorrectly? Like how do we fix those problems? And those are hard to do and they require a lot of work to actually think through, right? You can have these sort of like proof of neighbor ideas, but those are well, and those could be cool, right? It could force you to have good relationships with your neighbors,
Mhm.
and that could incentivize good behavior. Um, yeah, and I think some of the purest models for thinking about like what could decentralized government look like is is like these big new crypto projects where they're truly decentralized organizations and they truly have voting power from the token holders and they're really controlling billions of dollars. So if someone can abuse their governance system, they just lost billions of dollars, right? So that's like a pretty good incentive to get it right.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I was going to say, on a meta level, one of the most appealing things about the entire crypto space is that a tremendous amount of the problems that they're tasked with solving at various communities are these kinds of problems. How do you build community? How do you, like, they're solving basic governance problems, and I don't mean governance in the term in the sense of government. I mean governance in the term in the sense of how do you coordinate together? How do you decide upon common rules? How do you organize processes within this system that are, like you said, going to prevent abuse, going to secure the system, going to provide some amount of equity for participants, etc. Um, a tremendous amount of energy goes into just simply designing these systems and setting them up the right way, and then also iterating on them, finding out, okay, what were the problems with the way that we set this one up? How could we set this up differently next time? Or how do we actually, through the processes that we've already created, how do we try to like go back and manipulate it, whether that's forking or something less drastic, um, to figure that out. And so that's actually one of the biggest appeals to me, is that they're actually solving all of these like core governance problems that you would think about, for example, if you were setting up a new country, right? If you were setting up a new country, and let's say you have like an initial starting population and an initial treasury, um, you would have to like build out an entire system for how everything would be distributed, and also how everything would be governed. um and I see that's what's happening in the virtual space inside of these communities, and that's really what's exciting about it to me. I guess one last thing I'll say on this is that uh you know the history of like constitutional republics is based on this concept of a social contract, right? So we have social contract theory, and even though none of us signed the U.S. Constitution, we are in effect bound to this social contract that exists. And in principle, we've talked a little bit about how maybe some of this stuff is actually difficult to implement in a real sense, but in principle, there's no reason for uh, having the rules of your government laid out on a 300-year-old piece of paper, right? Um,
Yeah.
and you could have something like a constitution that is in the form of a smart contract. Now, again, it's unclear exactly how that would all be implemented, how you would verify that the rules are being followed, et cetera, et cetera. There's going to be all kinds of room for discretion on the part of you know voting members and judges and whatnot, because at some point you have to interface with the real human world. But
Hmm.
this is like the core idea that I wanted to get around to, which is that if you have a community of people and you have a common currency and you have a set of rules that they follow, then you pretty much have a country, with the only difference being that there's not a recognition of sovereignty, and they don't control like a piece of physical land. Would that be correct in your opinion?
Maybe. I mean, I think that you can kind of have these like pseudo, like to the extent, that we call like multinational corporations, like nationless, right? I think like you could draw a comparison to that. I think, I mean, I'm kind of a believer that at the end of the day, like sovereignty kind of comes down to physical defensibility.
Mhm.
And I don't think that that necessarily like speaks to that, or has an impact on it. But yeah, I mean, you absolutely can create these collectives of people that are agreeing to these rules and are kind of like bound to them from the outset, and you have much stronger guarantees around it. And you know I think that like looking back on say, oh well, could we have redone the US Constitution, like if we had this technology, like that could be interesting. But it would be really hard. But where maybe looking forward, like okay, as we get more and more into the digital world, right? Like as we live more in virtual reality, or we have just more of our existence embedded in this like digital ecosystem, then I think that these kinds of systems will gain a lot more power because they actually have enforceability. um and so you will have these kind of like really powerful entities that live in the digital space that are governed in these ways, and you're kind of already starting to have that, where you do have these pools of capital and control, where you can say, well, who's allowed to write code to this system is controlled by voting rights, and what are the ways that people are allowed. Like for instance, you could create an Uber
Mhm.
where it was a completely decentralized system, and you had the ability to commit to the code base and publish the app was controlled by voting rights and a token, and who got paid out and how much was controlled by the system, right? So this is a thing that is virtual, but kind of has strong implications in the real world because of the incentive system it's creating around it. Um, as far as like full sovereign nation kind of things, like, I think that it's possible. And but I kind of get too caught up in I think defining rules that really address all the edge cases and all the different incentives that you create is really, really, really hard to do right. And when that happens with the Constitution, we kind of just go like, oh, let's think about that, or like let's give some judges the ability to like think that through a little bit more carefully. And with smart contracts, like that's not an option. Or then you have to go and you have to create like a second layer of government. You have to go like, oh, okay, we're going to create this like interpretation layer over our smart contract layer.
Mhm.
Or you have to create the smart contract layer in such a way that it's like very mutable. Um, and then how is it mutable, right? Like, because we kind of have that. We say, okay, well, if 2/3 of the Congress says change it, so it goes.
Yeah.
And so it could work. I mean, it could be cool. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if some people try it.
Yeah, definitely. And you could even have like an internal judge system where a small number of participants have like let's say outsized voting power on particular issues and the ability to amend contracts or rewrite them or something like that. Uh,
Hmm.
you could actually, do a lot of stuff that way. And then of course, uh yeah, I think there are a lot of problems is like, for example, like how do you actually legislate? Um is like unclear. Like, are you gonna like take every piece of legislation that gets passed and like turn it into a smart contract? Probably not. I don't know exactly like what the benefit would there would be. But again, whenever we legislate anything, those are ultimately just like a bunch of words that are written somewhere on a document, and people agree to follow them because they're supposed to. And that's basically the extent of it. Of course, it's backed up by force at some point, but most of the
Hmm.
time, that's not what's happening. Most of the time, the piece of paper goes out, and then everybody hears about it, and then these are the rules now. We're playing by these new rules, and
But
so
so
it's
then playing devil's advocate, like, what's the
yeah.
value of putting it in a smart contract versus paper?
Well, I mean, I don't think that there. I mean, like I said, I don't think there necessarily is going to be one in every case. I just think in terms of how you can the design fit space for governance and voting and these kinds of things is drastically expanded by the existence of these technologies. And so
Hmm.
the way that our system is set up now is very old. And the founders who are imagining, let's say, the American system, uh, didn't have a lot of history to go off of in terms of previous democracies that actually like were successful and lived a long time. And so they crafted the best system that they could. And, uh, there are obviously improvements to be made upon that. It's not clear exactly what those might be, but there are lots of arguments that you can put forward about how the Constitution could be differently, or how separation of powers could go differently, or how you might reorganize Congress, and all of that was basically, based on this like old parliamentary framework, or well, actually, for the U.S. Congress, it would have been like pre-parliamentary. I mean, there was some aspects of English inheritance, but they were also looking at like, for example, like the Roman and Athenian democracies. Um, and so I just see this as a way to, as a starting point for rethinking like how we could do all of this stuff all over again. Because
Hmm.
back in 1776 or whatever it might have been, they had to figure out a way to like create a democracy where one didn't exist, give everyone plausible stake in the system through voting power and certain kinds of rights and property rights and so forth. And so this just gives us an opportunity to do some interesting thought experiments about how all of that could be reshaped. And a lot of the way that it could be reshaped is by this core principle of decentralization changes a lot of how you would reconstruct something if you were starting over from scratch.
Hmm. Well, I think, I'm really excited just that there are a ton of really smart people all of a sudden now thinking about like, oh, well, actually, this is kind of a hairy problem. And how do we actually like mechanistically come up with, consensus in a decentralized format, right? Because at some level, well, we're a republic, right? But we pretend that we're a
Mhm.
pure democracy and like, okay, so we're striving for this ideal of like everybody gets a vote. Um, and so just thinking through the problems really associated with that, like, I think could result in people coming up with interesting ideas of like what should government look like in the next era. And there are people like that are putting this into practice at not a nation state level, but a like, we have this project, it's an impactful project, it manages like material amounts of resources, and it's being completely managed decentralized in a decentralized way. And so it's gonna be cool to see how this all plays out. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but you also introduce like lots of new problems, right? Like, okay,
Mhm.
well, when a senator loses, how do you confiscate their private key? and
Right.
or when someone
How do
dies
you
and you
hand
can't find the
over
key.
ownership of their office?
Yeah, like key management becomes just like this nightmare problem that like needs to be solved. And I think Vitalik has some interesting ideas about this around um, kind of similar to that neighbor idea. Like, there has to be some concept of like, can your friends reinstate this for you?
Mm.
And I like building like systems like that because it's getting back to community. It's kind of like pushing people to be more human with this because of this digital layer.
Yeah.
And that could be a cool thing that emerges.
Yeah, I mean, so it'll be interesting what kind of problems we can get solved. But I definitely agree with you that most of the problems that there are to solve, which there are many, are extremely hairy problems, and you actually do need like really brilliant, smart, technical people who are working on these in a real way in terms of infrastructure to kind of build that because there's just so much left to build. There's so much left to build. All right,
Absolutely.
Gabriel. Well, we're close to the end of our time here today. I wanted to thank you so much for coming on. This has been really good primer for just sort of beginning to delve into this question about what are the implications for decentralization on the future of governance. Last thing I wanted to ask you before I let you go is what are you hoping for to see within the next 5 to 10 years in terms of developments in this space?
Mm. Um, well, I'm excited for some of these projects that are coming out, like that really seem to be hitting the stride of like transactions are happening really quickly. People are able to build meaningful systems with good interfaces. So I'm excited for kind of um, you know DeFi to get its wings. And more than that, like, I'm excited for people to say, okay, blockchain's great, but how can we build really good, robust, decentralized systems that maybe blockchain's not the best solution? Like, how do we build social networks that are decentralized? How do we build just general, like high privacy, highly decentralized, encrypted utilities for the internet? And I'm excited that some of those things are going to start rolling out.
Cool. Well, thanks so much. This has been great. I appreciate you coming on.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Alex.